Good afternoon, I'm Lauren McCoy.
And I'm Liz Reyes. Mixed reaction today after a report that the Orleans Civil Court judge who approved lowering the signature threshold for the recall of Mayor Cantrell also signed the recall petition.
And as Natasha Robin reports, while some believe the judge should have recused herself from this case, others say she did nothing wrong.
The question becomes, should she have recused herself? Was she required to recuse herself? The answer, I think, is no.
This seems very clear to me that the judge should have immediately recused herself.
There are very different opinions about whether Civil Court Judge Jennifer Medley should have recused herself from the case between recall organizers and the Secretary of State's office. Since NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune says the judge had previously signed the recall petition.
If you have a judge who's adjudicating a matter involving a recall election, and that judge has in fact signed the petition for recall, that judge has indicated that their interests are coincident with one of the parties to this case, which are the recall organizers.
Law professor and civil procedure expert Joel Friedman says all judges are governed by a judicial code of ethics, which he says makes it very clear about avoiding conflicts or even the appearance of a conflict.
At a minimum, she should have revealed the conflict to the parties.
Judge Medley expressed by signing the recall petition, she expressed sort of her no confidence vote. She's not confident in the job the mayor's doing. That's what all of us can do when we vote or when we sign a recall petition. But bias alone isn't enough here in terms of recusal. It would have to be bias that would affect the judge's ability to do her job.
Attorney Andrew Lilly says the judge's job in this case had more to do with the accuracy of the voter rolls.
I don't think that Judge Medley would have to use or sort of suppress her bias to make a decision on that.
Lilly also doesn't believe Judge Medley was obligated to even disclose that she'd signed the petition.
There's no behind-the-scenes reason why Judge Medley would need to have disclosed, hey, I signed this thing. I mean, can you imagine the implications if we take this judge to task for signing the recall petition? At what point are we going to start scrutinizing what Judge Medley who she voted for?
Judge Medley endorsed a deal between the recall organizers and the Secretary of State to lower the recall threshold by 5,000 signatures. Friedman says while the mayor wasn't a party to that agreement, the outcome will certainly affect the recall effort.
For a judge to participate in this, even to sanction this agreement, when the judge had a clear symmetry of interest with one of the parties, the recall organizers, is clearly a conflict of interest that should have been, I think, the basis for a recusal.
The civil court spokesman told us Judge Medley couldn't comment on pending or ongoing litigation. The mayor's attorney called the situation very disturbing and went on to say in a statement, it is important that there is full disclosure to maintain the confidence of the voting public.
This is about judges having the appearance to the public that they are completely dispassionate and unbiased with respect to every matter that comes before them.
Natasha Robin, Fox 8, Local First.